First work I've done that really specifically deals with Lynn's work. And so it feels like a big legacy moment for me. It was really exciting to go back and read all of it and think. I'm not presenting today. Today, my co-author, Alexei Zakharov, who is at the University of Chicago Harris School, will be presenting this work, and he'll talk about the origins of the work and our broader research team in the first couple minutes of this.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm a visitor at Harris School, originally from High School of Economics in Moscow, and this project is part of a larger project holding also anybody Israel Marcus. There are a bunch of other papers in the pipeline using the same data. So the broad question that we want to answer is, can social policy imposed by autocratic governments facilitate changes in pro-social norms? And so what do? We look at a top-down autocratic housing policy that was achieved in 2017. That policy in turn promoted quite intense interactions between people who would be affected by the policy in order to understand what's going on, because so much was at stake. Housing is a large part of an average. Probably most of the a Russian's wealth is his or her apartment. So a lot was at stake, and people had to interact to organize house level votes, to campaign for and against. And we use a custom survey to compare people who resided in buildings that were affected by the policy and they were not affected by the policy. And our goal was to compare the two subsamples and see whether involvement with this policy led to changes in pro-social norms, and whether also there were spillover effects to other types of political or civic activity. So here is basically an anecdotal example of what was going on, of what we are in our paper are trying to pin down. So I'm acquainted with about 60% of my neighbors, and these 60% were stretched, meaning they were meaning they were stressed out, yes, about this this renovation. And I've seen so many new faces, and they were so active. And one person comes to see you, then the second comes to see you, then everybody gathers together, and this is when we met each other. So this is the mechanism that we want to find empirical evidence for. Now we know from literature that social norms are very, very important. They are essential for governance and growth, and they've been studied in a variety of contexts. And our study focuses on an autocratic social policy taking place over a short time, not over a long historical time periods, as many other works do. And this autocratic policy is actually conducive to the social capital, unlike other studies involving autocracies that look at effects of stuff like repression, and the effects are bad, or maybe that authoritarian government negates the positive role of middle class on the development of civic and social capital. We are looking at a very kind of special set of circumstances. Okay, now these are 5-story buildings. They were built in late 50s and 1960s for most of them. So this is a typical block of 5-story buildings. Each building has 4 stairways, so it's 80 apartments in each building. And they were built very quickly because Moscow had a housing crisis in following World War II. It was overpopulated, and probably over 1 million people were settled in those buildings over 15 years from mid-50s. But soon these buildings became unpopular because newer designs had larger flats. So this a two-room flat would be in a new building would be probably 20% larger, meaning that it would be more expensive, meaning that it would probably be the order of the difference in the value would be probably at least a yearly salary, or maybe more than that. So with this program, a lot was at stake for the residents. And in May 2017, the Moscow city government published a list of about 4,500 buildings where people would have to hold a vote. They were given like an online platform to vote. They could also vote offline at a certain location, at certain locations. And so two-thirds support was required for to opt in into the program. And since basically many people believed that the program was beneficial, many people thought that you would receive a larger apartment if you joined the program. And the program was actually, it would take a long time. Most of the actual relocations haven't started yet. They're supposed to, the bulk of relocations is supposed to take place over after 2024. But in order to be eligible to be relocated, your building had to vote positively in that initial wave of voting. So, but also a lot of people were concerned that they would more apartments would be crammed into the same space, because the old buildings were 5 stories and the new ones would be 25 stories, and there would be infrastructure overload and so forth. So a lot of people also were upset about the program, and there was some opposition to the program. Right, so what do we expect? What hypotheses do we expect? That first, the level of pro-social norms should be higher for residents of included buildings compared to residents of eligible buildings that were not included. Second, the effect of buildings inclusion into the program on pro-social norms should be higher for those residents who were more deeply engaged with in consultation processes related to this program. And the third one is that in smaller buildings, it takes the cost of coordination as smaller. It takes a smaller number of activists in order to, for example, organize a campaign against the program. And activists have cost of collective action of their own. So we expect these effects be higher in smaller buildings. Now, there was opposition to this program, and that produced empirical challenges, because the selection of buildings into the program was non-random. And we had to carefully design the matched pair sample of buildings where we would interview people. So what we did is we looked at an electoral precinct. An electoral precinct is, well, this is an electoral precinct here. It's about this big. So we looked at every electoral precinct in Moscow that contained one building that was included and one building that was not included, and we selected the most proximate pair of buildings among all possible such pairs, and we interviewed people in the excluded and in the included buildings. Now, why did we do it? Because because the city government also had the same information as we did. They had electoral return information from the precinct. They did not have information on individual on how would the political beliefs in each individual building. So now, so what are our results? This is the first dependent variable called generic pro-social norms. So do you think you can count on the help of your neighbors? Do you interact with your neighbors over the past year? Did you help your neighbors, or neighbors help you to solve some problem? Did you take keys from the apartment to watch over the apartment, help with the child, and so forth? And here, both the index composed from these these five variables and two of the five variables individually, the difference was significant, and the value of the variable was larger in the included buildings. Then we looked at how specific social norms did the person engage, take part in the production of house level public good, such as doing community work, participating in repair of the stairway, and so forth. And the result is the same. For two of these items individually, the difference was significant, and also for the index. And finally, of course, there was a number of questions of how actively a person participated in this process that was related to the renovation program, and the difference, of course, was very high between included and excluded buildings. By the way, the survey took place in a year and a half after the vote took place. Now, here's a mediation analysis. We do the same thing. We run a regression where the main dependent variable is whether or not the building was included in the program. And what we see here is that if we just regress the generic social capital on this dependent variable, on this independent variable, then the coefficient is significant, so there is a significant direct effect. But if we include policy-specific interaction, this coefficient, the significance of this coefficient disappears. So all the significance is here. So this is so we interpret it as policy interactions mediating the effect of program inclusion on generic social capital, and the same is for house-specific social capital. And then formally tested more formally using a Markov chain Monte Carlo procedure, and we actually find that this mediation effect is highly significant. It's pretty robust to unobservables. We need to have an unobservable which is very highly correlated with the outcome in order to spoil our result. Now we look at the heterogeneity of treatment effects. Here is the distribution of the apartments of the buildings by the number of apartments, well, it's mostly in multiples of 20 because of the way the things are. And here our effects are indeed heterogeneous, and indeed the number of apartments moderates the effect of program inclusion on house-specific social capital and on generic social capitals. Oh my God, I didn't mark them. This is policy-specific interaction. This is generic social capital. This is house-specific social capital. Okay, and then I can talk briefly about spillover effects. In 2018, in June 2018, the Russian government announced a gradual increase in the retirement age, and this was like a hugely unpopular measure that eroded Putin's approval rating very considerably. And we asked questions about whether or not you participated in any of the protests or petitions that were related to the increase in the retirement age. And guess what? People who lived in the included apartments were more likely to have participated, and the size of the building also had the same the same moderating effect on participation in pension reform interactions. So there was a spillover effect, and there was also a spillover effect. Although this time we didn't find heterogeneity with respect to the number of apartments, but there was also a spillover effect with respect to participation in 2018 mayoral vote. People who participated, people in the included buildings were more likely to have voted. So that's about it. That's we show that we expect information of cross-social norms from policy that was not designed to facilitate them. And the broader conclusion is that document norm accumulation in the authoritarian context. See that there are patterns similar to democratic regimes. And of course, more work needs to be done to see whether these effects are durable. Now, these effects took like a year and a half. Okay, so that's, I think I'm on time.
Good. How do we do this question?
So you want to keep the queue or I do
Yeah.
it? So online we are going to see them. So if they,
Oh,
they are going to put it on the chat or they can raise their hand. So I can help with that too.
okay. Go ahead, Jess.
And you can check.
This is super cool. Although I should warn you, I sound way worse than I am. Not actually. Super cool. So I have a couple of questions, having admittedly not had a chance to be as involved with the paper as I wanted to be. Two, I was just searching to just see if you had differential effects on different you have a bunch of different questions that are asking about different kinds of social norms, each of which incur different kinds of costs, right? And I guess one question is do you have any sense of like, is this uniform across the relative cost of social norm adherence? Right? I would expect that to vary quite a bit. Relying on your willingness to rely on your neighbors is very different from participating in a rally that you can get request for. But I think you have that, so I don't want to belabor that point. My other question was in terms of mechanism, what is it about this policy? Is it that it engenders backlash? Is it that you sort of have uncertainty in the title early on? Is it about the uncertainty of it and that lends to sort of information transmission and then organization around that information? So I'd be curious about what is it specific to autocratic policy specifically, or what about this policy in your mind is a mechanism that is differentiable from other mechanisms and that is fundamentally at work specific to housing policy in Russia?
You want to talk about the first one?
I'll answer the last question. It's about both. It did engender a backlash because many, and also it did initially, at least, there was a lot of uncertainty that people had to talk to one another in order to resolve this sort of uncertainty. Where are we going? Is the government going to keep its promise of not resettling too far from where we live right now? This probably was the biggest concern that people had, that they would be moved outside somewhere in the deep suburbs. So people had to resolve a lot of uncertainty. They had to talk to officials, and officials were also talking to them a lot in order to mobilize them to vote. And there was an opposite mobilization of in some buildings there were activists. They were campaigning against the program.
So I would also add that this policy had a lot of the attributes that Lynn talks about in her own work about policy engendering collective action. It was fairly transparent. So within houses, people knew who was participating and wasn't participating. There's well documented in our focus groups and in other work, social sanctions for people. Mm-hmm. So there was actually incentives and benefits, and there was this need to collect information, this common pursuit of collecting information to resolve.
So if I can just really follow up quickly, in terms of scope conditions about this policy and what about it is what matters about autocracy here? Is it that there's a general lack of pro-social norms because people live in an autocracy and therefore these particular policies can facilitate them in their absence? We expect to see this in regions that are not autocratic, but may or may not have pro-social norms. I'd just be curious about the sort of 2x2 of sort of scope conditions on this particular policy applied in a particular autocratic context. Is it the policy that's autocratic or the context that's autocratic? What is it that matters there?
Do you want me to, I'll start.
Yeah.
So there is some literature that says top-down imposed policies won't generate these norms. And here you have a policy that was announced on TV with incentives for engagement that do generate norms. So that's one issue. The second is starting from quite a low point of pro-sociality, even within houses. These, Alexei didn't say this, but when I talk to people, maybe Sasha had something to say here too. When I talk to people, you know, neighbors rarely interact. Neighbor interaction is really rare. This is quite a big change, a big jump. So it's, I think those are the two things that we think about here.
Can I go with a question?
And also, of course, the goal of this autocratic policy was not to engender norms. The goal was to enrich the construction industry. But this outcome is completely kind of it's a byproduct. It's unlike the community-driven development projects that whatever interactions we have here, they were completely a byproduct of.
Yeah, so what we find is that unlike those community-driven development projects that were all the vogue a decade ago, that we actually find a positive effect of these interactions, whereas those cases developed to construct interaction didn't work. And that's what's so interesting here. So
yeah, because the community-driven development projects, they mostly the way I see it, they didn't produce much positive results.
I'm curious.
No, yeah.
I'm curious about the, and maybe you don't have data on this, but like the kinds of relationships that people formed with neighbors. Was it that they would have like one neighbor they would really trust and count on all the time, or lots of like more looser ties to neighbors?
Maybe you have focus groups.
yeah, well, we have the empirical findings of these high levels of interactions about dependence and you know, care of public spaces within the house and these kinds of things, increasing between included residents of buildings included and not included. Because you would almost expect, like if you're included, your house is going to be torn down and you're moving somewhere else. So even this investment in the upkeep of the house in the interim is quite interesting, right? Yeah. But we also did focus groups here. So we complement this with focus groups. And what you see is there are really in the focus groups, 3 types of people. The people who say the government's going to do what it wants anyway, and they kind of step out. And we see those people in the discussion of focus groups, but also in the work. And then you have the people who say, I am so excited that I've gotten to know my neighbors and I feel integrated into a community. And it's not even this padej, this entry is really important for how Russians interact in an apartment building. But there's a lot of discussion in the focus groups about going cross padej and meeting bigger people. So it's definitely a bigger network. And it definitely steps out of the more formal relations of the house elder or the house, it's not the manager, he's the informal manager, going beyond that person to larger connections about sharing information that they learn online or that they learn through other things. So it's definitely in the focus groups, you see big networks emerging.
People normally don't interact over the governance of the buildings. It's unless, as a rule, this is taken over by a city-appointed company that does whatever it wants. And here people were forced basically, or had to, and were incentivized to participate in this project to kind of get together and kind of think what would my position be with respect to this very important question.
Can I go? Or
Yeah.
So
Who-
we can
who have
pick
it?
one from John as well, but you
Yeah,
can
so-
go next yourself either way.
So I was thinking about
John,
two things. The first one is, so from the point of view of the government, so imagine that you decide that you want to do this. Politically speaking, what's the cheapest way of doing it? So if you do it fully top down, you risk serious collective action problems. So this was a minimizing collective action decision by the government. So you can see it in that way. So, essentially you are observing some level, but it's lower than what you would have observed with a fully top-down approach, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is that almost by definition, this, well, I was thinking, so in the long run, or maybe not in the long run, but so when they are moved, those cases in which they are successful and they move, the social norms will wash away anyway, because they will be relocated. So they're not going to be interacting with their neighbors anyway in the future once they are moved. So from the point of view of the regime, that's also, well, you get some little bit of problem there, but then those people that are more pro-social, they could organize, they will be moved, take out of their communities, and they have to be reinserted in new communities, like essentially, so it seems like a good policy from the point of view of the regime. Again, so maybe I'm playing the devil's advocate here, but what would be the best answer to these type of things?
First, a little bit more detail on how what the devil does. So this is basically a basic course in Moscow political geography. So this is share of people in education in 2002 on the census. This is vote for Alexei Navalny in 2013. These are highly correlated things, right? Opposition attitudes and higher education. Well, this is following, this is because the Moscow settlement followed railroad network, and in a center and southwest, it was like more hilly terrain, fewer railroads and more white collar in white collar places, with the most of the industry being in the east. Now, this is the share of five-story buildings included in the program. So the government was even given the repressive apparatus that Russian government has, it still tries to minimize resistance and kind of maintain a sense of legitimacy. So this is on one hand. So on one hand, it is the selection of buildings into the program was based on the level of opposition, and it was to minimize the expected level of opposition. And that's why in those buildings that were selected, over 90% of the buildings voted for. And that's kind of this is why we had an empirical challenge. We had to kind of exercise a lot of precaution when selecting the data set. Then the next question: will this social capital, is the social capital specific to the pairs of people? Will it fall apart? Okay, I'm friends with my neighbor. When I move, the neighbor will no longer be here, and the social capital will be gone. That's an interesting question. We didn't yet do a follow-up. It'll be probably very difficult to track those people down. It'll probably be nearly impossible. It'll require personal data, which we, because here we simply interviewed people in front of the buildings. Do you live here? If the person lives here, he or she is screened in. So it'll be very hard to see if this increase in social capital would persist when the same neighbors will no longer.
And unfortunately, we were just in the process of coming up with a second round, a follow-up survey when
All the stuff happened.
catastrophe happened. And now it would be almost impossible just because there's this huge intervening factor now in social relationships that we are very conflated with what we're studying. I will say two things, just let me add. One is the pension reform is very much what you described, a very top-down, no contestation. And that was deeply problematic for the regime. So in some ways, you're right that I think housing policy was almost like a legitimation experiment to try to see if policy could be used to counter some of these less popular things. But also this spillover into voting, right? So it leads to voting turnover. So there is some broader effect than just relationships that may be different social effects. But unfortunately, Alexei is right. We maybe can do semi-structured interviews with people who have moved, but it's unlikely that we'll be able to do surveys.
Can I have a follow-up with voting? Is voting, but it's they just voting, or it's voting against the regime in favor of the opposition? Do you know something about that? Or?
No, we just asked them if they voted, the act of
voted.
voting. Yeah.
So it
we-
might be that they are happy about the program, and then they vote more and they vote for the regime.
Well,
It could be a legitimizing.
in a different paper, we I look at whether participation in the program affects redistribution preferences, and it also affects trust toward you believe that bureaucracy is less corrupt. You trust the mayor more. So this is yes. This program did produce trust toward state institutions.
I see. Yeah.
We did have a couple online, if that's.
Yeah,
okay.
sorry, yeah.
Regina. So John Horowitz, and John, feel free to chime in, okay? If that's, but I'll just read what you have so far. So John was asking how much can inhabitants change the interior of their apartments, such as moving walls? And are the free planned apartments all in the better educated areas? Do they affect social capital?
Now, that's a good question. Now, first of all, we actually had a question whether or not the frames are made of wood or plastic, and the legacy is wood. So if a person, it's kind of a marker for whether there was whether the person invested into the apartment. That and by the way, our sample was balanced with respect to that. So yes, you can make changes to your apartment. You cannot remove walls because it's prefabricated concrete. You cannot. It's not a good idea. But you can make a hole in the wall. But it's also it's like totally making a hole in the wall is possible, but it's very. It's like a very bureaucratic procedure. Making other renovations, it's easy.
And John, I'm not sure if you had any follow-ups there, but feel free to chime in if you do. Otherwise, I think.
So what was our finding on higher education here? Because higher education is usually a strong predictor of
Our sample is balanced
in the heterogeneous effects.
with respect to higher education.
Yeah.
It was slightly imbalanced with a number of years that on average the person lived in the apartment, but we included all these variables as controls.
Yeah.
I see John there now. Was that useful, John, or did you have anything else you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I was also So are all the free plan apartments in the richer areas, or does that vary?
Now, again, the way this sample was produced, that so in each, we selected, let's see, here are some detail. Yes, we selected 50 groups of buildings. Each group corresponded to an electoral precinct. And within each electoral precinct, we selected one building that was included and one building that was not included in the program. And maybe there were some more buildings of each type. So our sample was balanced with respect to the kind of location, and actually we had, for some of the buildings, we had real estate price, the average price of real estate for 2016 scraped from the website for a different project, and it was balanced for the two groups of buildings.
Do you have the map of the distribution of buildings throughout Moscow?
No,
You have that map here?
no, I don't have
So, yes, so it was the case that these buildings, some were concentrated in the very city center and had huge value. Some were concentrated on important roads leading out of Moscow, had big value. Others were in less valuable parts, but they were definitely places that people like to live.
in our sample, we didn't have much buildings in the center.
Right.
Most of them were in the suburbs. This is the share of 5-story buildings that were included in the program for each district. And the majority is here in the center. There are few 5-story buildings, and very few of them were included in the program.
So it's maybe interesting context that these buildings were built usually attached to factories. So they were attached to middle level management, sort of factory housing. And so they weren't necessarily in the most beautiful parts of the city.
And since they're probably all older, it probably is irrelevant to my question, where I believe development companies started developing these buildings with the support walls on the outside so that people could design their own apartments, because my understanding is some of the richer or higher income people would go in, tear out what some of the development companies did, and so they actually started working with people to design their own apartments.
In the renovation, in the post-renovation, or in the Khrushchevsky construction?
My understanding, my understanding was in construction. So yeah, I'm looking at a well, pardon my Russian, Koroneva, who actually talks about the process of trying to, and I'm kind of trying to get a paper done on this, and that's why I was interested in what you're doing, you know, in terms of giving people within the buildings autonomy. But I think it's a related question, but also depends on the age of the building.
Yeah, so in these buildings, they were all prefabricated, built off-site. There were two specific types of buildings, one brick, one concrete slab, and they were prefabricated and brought in. They were very uniform. In fact, that was sort of like a plus at the time. They were meant to be built quickly and inexpensively. And I've read a lot of the historic literature, and I haven't heard anything about sort of consultation in the 50s. So they started in 59 and went right up till the very early 70s in this period.
Thank you.
And Travis had hand up.
Thanks, Travis. Hi, Travis, do you want to ask your question?
Hey, Dr. La. Let me echo, I think that was Jessica's hoarse but lovely voice, that this is really impressive. I mean, you have some amazing stuff here. And one of the things that's, I guess it was Jessica, and one of the things that's very cool is the response rate was astounding. So I'm curious about something, and this is just out of curiosity. When you interviewed folks, or when your team interviewed folks outside buildings that weren't going to be renovated, were there any discussions about, gee, we want that and maybe we will organize? Or was there such a distrust of the builders maybe, and that this was a profit thing initially, that they just said, oh, thank God this is not in our building?
Maybe more question to the focus.
Yeah, so yes, there were people who were left out of the first round of inclusion by the mayor, who and then sort of in a performance of good czar, President Putin went and said you can have a mechanism to be included. You could petition to be included, so that there was actually a bunch of buildings that were included late into the process. And subsequent to that, a bunch of buildings that were then eminent domained into the process by construction buildings who then wanted economies of scale, right? So they would include buildings in. So there were several ways, and it's a really tiny sample. We were talking about this last night because I'm obsessed with this group. And some early poking around in the data shows that those people forced to petition had the most increase. And but it's not a great, it's not something we can statistically hang our hat on, but I've poked around on it some, and so has Alexei.
But the results hold if you take them out.
Hmm.
The results hold if you take them out.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, they hold. So
Cool.
they're not in this story. So between the time that Alexei drew the sample, he did this gorgeous matching, and the time that we knew what was included, we had some buildings in our sample that were later included by mistake. So we had to go and fix that part of the work because we just didn't know.
Thank you. It's possible. Sorry.
Well, Lydia.
All right, thanks so much for your paper, both. Yeah, it is fascinating because and exciting and like promising, because amidst all the conversations about how atomized Russian society is, you show that actually maybe not always, and that actually there's change, right? And people do form communities. But I wonder if you can, and it's not as my question is not your statistical findings, but I wonder if you could speculate whether the spillover effects will continue, and whether they could continue and even like jump into political issues. But in other words, do you think people who like got experience mobilizing, right, together, like the people you surveyed, might continue doing so, even when the issue at hand, the issue to resist is like explicitly political? Well, because the renovation program, was not, political, and it was, of course it was, but not maybe formally political, right? It was a housing issue, right? It was a social policy that people protested. Same with the pension reform. But right, if we look at issues currently happening in Russia, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So let me just say, you're touching on this thing that probably other people don't know, but in Russia, there's a bifurcation in the way that people think about activism as being non-political, which is disruption in everyday life and sort of okay and acceptable, and political, which is contesting election fraud or leadership or regime and so forth. So there is this dichotomy that we see in all sorts of studies. But do you want to? I have lots of ideas about this, but
it will be difficult to hunt down those people because after our survey took place a year and a half after in late 2018, and since then a lot of people have moved because many people moved in because they were kind of knew that they would obtain different bigger apartments, and so many, even repeating this sort of, some of the buildings were resettled, like some fraction of the buildings were resettled. So repeating this survey would not be possible.
Just not.
It's
But
just not.
I think it points to two things about the war, like that's all we think about, right? One is that domestic politics is really different from foreign policy, and that there's almost a wall between foreign policy and domestic politics and how people respond. And the second is that people respond more when direct policies disrupt their everyday lives. So it takes time for the war, conscription, sanctions to start upsetting everyday lives. And for that policy to be attributed not to the West or NATO or someone else, but to be attributed to the decisions of the government. So this points to some ways in which the mechanism, it could happen, but it doesn't tell, it leaves uncertain how, which particular triggers and all of that kind of stuff. So Alexei is so good about staying to the data, and I went beyond the data.
That's what that's.
But there's definitely.
She opened the door, so she asked for it.
What I kind of know, there is definitely spillovers from civic activism to political activism. So many of the people I know as political activists, they started out as non-political.
Became politicized.
And then became politicized. So probably the answer to your question is yes, but we don't have, we cannot prove.
Same with feminist activists, with LGBTQ activists, and that's right. Similar a bit. If I may follow up just real quick. So I wonder if you could, I understand that it would not be possible for you to send people on the ground to go like and survey anyone right now, but I know that I think in my hometown of St. Petersburg, there's a similar renovation program had been proposed. I am not sure if it's going to go on or like happen, but there have been talks about it earlier, like a couple months ago. So I wonder if you could find other ways to access people, if that happened in another city like St. Petersburg, if you could do that. For example, you probably know about the, I don't know what, so how do I translate? So that's the camaraderie of property owners, right? So these are like these micro communities, residents, owners, right? Apartment owners in a given apartment block often start, and they typically start like a WhatsApp chat or some other kind of like on conversation online on a messenger, which every property owner in a given building can join, and so they just have these chats available to like discuss community issues, right? Sanitation and so on, renovations. If you could have access to these channels of information, for example, to see, well, as one option that I was thinking of, but I wonder if you could see, if you could follow up on in a different city affected, which has a similar program.
Well, yeah, I'll have to look at the way this program was organized in other cities. Yes. Now we know that a very small fraction of the 5-story buildings were organized as decisions. Almost none. So most of the residents in those buildings, something like this would happen.
Okay.
They kind of took a much smaller fraction of 5-story buildings at SSG compared to newer buildings.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So Alexei didn't say that, but this is I'm surprised we didn't get the endogeneity question, right? How do we know that these included buildings didn't have higher social capital to begin with or higher gross sociality? And one of the things we looked at is that there are to privatize the land below the apartment and also to take over the construction of the apartment, you need prior collective action. And these buildings didn't have different levels of prior collective action. So that's how we're controlling for endogeneity here, which I really liked. But one of us who's less constrained by data would like to write a book about this because as Alexei said in the beginning, we have several papers related to this project that are all beautiful and technical but I do think that looking at Telegram chats in new buildings or new neighborhoods is just good anecdotal data. Or I've been trying to raising some money to do internet ethnography and just interview people who have moved. So we're looking at these things. I'm thinking about how we might get some indication of what happens afterwards. Was there any indication in the Navalny protests that this kind of activism had effect? In the Navalny participation, the 2021?
Effect on what?
Participation, where had people prior been engaged in this everyday stuff?
So what's
So in the data that from the protests, from the 2021 protests,
yes?
did you ask questions about have you protested before?
No,
Yeah,
I didn't.
this is the problem with some of this stuff. It's hard to ask everything you wanna.
So can I have well, I don't want to change the thread, but it's a little bit different. So maybe a clarification of what were exactly the legal ownership rights that these people have to begin with. So essentially, it's just public housing, or they had some, or
Most of the
can you sell those things?
most of the majority, the large majority of these residents owned, it was their private property.
Okay.
And before the renovation program, the law was that every single resident has to agree to relocate before the building is demolished. Then, in order to facilitate this program, the construction industry lobbied to have a 2/3 rule, 2/3 majority. So you need if a 2/3 majority agrees to move, then this decision is binding on the other third.
Okay. Let's see.
And there was some evidence of manipulation of the vote in some buildings.
So I'm thinking what's effects on property,
A lot of people-
prices. So because there were some housing transactions on.
I think property prices increased following this program because the people, these apartments now in the future could be.
Give you the value option of a future move that is valuable.
Yeah.
That's also valuable information because it's like.
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about that, right? Of people trying to buy into buildings that weren't included because they'll be included in the future and so on.
See. So I'm thinking that so political speaking, it's that you're finding some mechanism that it's probably kind of against the regime because they form social norms, but you have a direct effect because you are kind of potentially happy with with a social program, being the beneficiary of a social program, either directly or indirectly because the property prices went up. So it could even reinforce your story because it's like, even with this effect that goes against you, you're finding a coefficient in the right direction for the collective action thing. So.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure that my increased trust in the state would crowd out collective action. Now, if this were to be true, then indeed what we have is an underestimate.
I see.
In another paper where we're looking at capacity to hold the right people responsible for the policy, to reward and punish the right people in the policy. We're also seeing that there is increased capacity in housing to put not blame, but responsibility on the mayor, whose office was out in front and running the program. Whereas in pensions, it's about the central government. So but much more amorphous, right? So this to help to target blame and accountability also.
There are no popular pension reforms everywhere in any
course.
regimes, so essentially. That if you find some, let me know. I will study that case. So-
So
Given the challenges just right now, I'm just curious what's next for you guys here, right? If you can't go back and do this follow-up, are you looking at other, kind of more hybrid regimes on the periphery of Russia that might be able to access that could have some of the same or similar dynamics in play, or is waiting to see how things play out over the next 6 months, right?
well, we have a lot of papers to finish out
that's right.
of this project, so we're going through that, and I really do have sort of a wish to turn this into a small book about housing and response to housing, the historical, I mean, because the project itself to build these buildings, I've been looking, I have some primary source historic documents, and the same language that Khrushchev uses about modernization and building the buildings is the same language they use about deconstructing the buildings. So there's sort of this odd policy line about the ideas of modernization. And so it's a very nice small story about housing and policy.
That makes me think that if you are not in touch with him already, but Gardner Bovingdon, do you know him at all?
Yeah.
So he's working on something about sort of architecture and building as a source of identity in post-Soviet states in the region. There's might be an interesting conversation.
It is, it's very symbolic. These houses are very symbolic, and many people were very attached to their houses and very opposed to having to move. Very sad about moving, and many had sunk all of their money into internal renovation. Even though the building itself was in bad shape. And
Still, just as like a final, I would still be super curious as like, are there other policies that you would expect to have the same effects? Like, what are the contours of those policies in an autocratic context that you would expect to yield these results?
yeah,
I know you want the book to be about housing and
yeah, but it isn't, it's, so pension is the opposite. So it's interesting in that effect, but probably environmental land preservation policies are probably the most similar kinds of things, where you also see a lot of activism in norm construction. So.
For sure.
We do have a national experiment data. We haven't even looked at it yet. Do you even know that there's data on the national experiment? Probably Alexei doesn't even. We did this big national experiment where we cued people about it worked this way in Moscow. Do you want it in your region?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we've just started to look at it. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
But this was the first paper and the most connected to Lynn. So we're happy to be here.
Looking forward to the book launch party.
Oh, that's right.
And I will tell you all that this project was born in this room because I was talking to Lee and Frederica, and they had just announced the policy. And I said to them, I think we can do a quasi experiment. And they were very encouraging and actually gave a little money to support the research. So this is full circle, right? And then connected up with these guys.
I'll mention
Yeah.
that, Billy, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh,
So we are running out of time, yes.
this was, congratulations. I can't wait to read the final. There is lunch, I believe.
There is lunch.
Speaking of.
After lunch, I'll just.
Yeah.
Forgot I did it on Friday.